Chester Nez stepped off the transport in New Mexico, still wearing his uniform. He had just come home from the Pacific, from fire and static and death. A civilian looked at him and refused to give him a bus seat. Then the man called him a name. Chester Nez said nothing. Not because he had nothing to say, but because what he had done in that war was classified top secret. He was legally forbidden from speaking about it. For 23 more years, he would not be allowed to say a word. This is the story of the Navajo Code Talkers, told through one man's face, one man's hands, one man's silence. Chester Nez was born on January 23, 1921. His birthplace was Chichilta, New Mexico, a place on the Navajo Nation. His mother died when he was young. His grandmother raised him. She spoke to him in Navajo. That language was the first sound he knew as home, the rhythm of it, the weight of it in his mouth as a child. He grew up on land his people had held, through war and removal and grief. And in 1929, when Chester was 8 years old, that changed. The United States government enrolled him in a boarding school at Todlena, New Mexico. He did not choose to go. The school had one primary rule about language: do not speak Navajo. If you did, a teacher would strike your hands. An 8-year-old boy, his hands. Chester Nez learned to go quiet in a way no child should have to learn. The language his grandmother had given him became something he had to hide. He tucked it away, kept it inside, carried it like something contraband. The government that ran those schools had a phrase for what they were doing: kill the Indian, save the man. Chester Nez survived that school. He kept the language they tried to take. He grew into a young man on the Navajo Nation as the world moved toward war. By 1942, he was 21 years old. Recruiters arrived at Fort Defiance, Arizona, looking for Navajo men. Not just any men. Men who still spoke the language. The same language the government had spent decades trying to erase. The same institution that struck Chester's hands for speaking Navajo now needed that language. Needed it urgently. Needed it to survive a war. The recruiters told the young men very little about why they were needed. Only that the Marines required something their language could provide. Chester Nez enlisted on August 4, 1942. He was one of the original 29 Navajo men chosen for this program. Not 29 who would join a system already built. 29 who would build it themselves, from nothing, from scratch. These 29 men would create a code that had never existed before. They arrived at Marine Corps Recruit Depot in San Diego in the spring of 1942. 29 young Navajo men in a military machine that did not fully know what to do with them, but they knew exactly what to do with themselves. At Camp Pendleton, they sat together and began to build. They took the Navajo language, their own living language, and bent it into something new. A dictionary of military terms encoded inside a language no enemy had studied. They created roughly 200 terms during that training period. Every word was chosen from inside a world the Axis powers had never entered. Chester Nez sat in those sessions knowing what this language had cost him as a boy. He chose to use it anyway. Not for the government that had punished him for it. For something older than that government. The Navajo people have a concept, the Na-Bahi, the warrior, not a soldier serving a nation-state, a protector of people and land. That tradition existed centuries before any American flag was planted on any soil. Chester Nez understood his enlistment through that lens, not through patriotic poster art. He carried a small medicine bundle with him into the Pacific. Traditional Navajo protection, beside his Marine Corps gear, inside his kit. Both things at once. Neither one canceling out the other. He later said he credited both his training and his traditional protection for his survival. The smell of that bundle, cedar, something dry and mineral and old, stayed with him. A thread back to Chichilta, to his grandmother's voice, to the language they'd tried to take. When Chester Nez shipped out to the Pacific Theater, the world was on fire. He served during the assault on Bougainville, Papua New Guinea, in November of 1943. Forward positions, under direct enemy fire. Operating a radio, the code moved through his voice across static and smoke and distance. Commanders received battlefield communications that enemy cryptanalysts could not crack. The system Chester and the original 29 had built was holding. By war's end, the program would expand to approximately 420 code talkers total. 420 men, roughly the enrollment of one small rural high school, carrying a classified secret for decades. But what Chester Nez came home to, that part is almost never told. The war ended in 1945. Chester Nez returned to New Mexico, still in uniform, still a Marine, still bound, from the moment he landed, by a classified secrecy oath. The oath did not end when the war did. It traveled home with him. He could not tell his family what he had done, not where he had served, not what his voice had carried across those Pacific frequencies. Not a word. Not one. Within days of arriving home, Chester Nez stood at a bus stop. He was in his Marine uniform, a decorated veteran, a man who had just come from war. A civilian refused him a seat and called him a racial slur. Chester Nez knew exactly what he had done in the Pacific. He knew what his voice had transmitted, what his code had protected, what lives it had saved. And he could say none of it. By law, he was forbidden from defending himself with the only defense that would have mattered. The bus pulled away. Imagine being a master locksmith who designed the most intricate vault in history, and for 23 years, you are legally forbidden to tell anyone you built it, even as people treat you like you've never done anything of value. That was Chester Nez's life from 1945 to 1968. The secrecy order remained classified. Chester remained silent. The question now is not what happened in the Pacific. That part has a monument. The question is what a man does with 23 years of enforced silence, what it costs him, how he carries it, and who he becomes on the other side. Chester Nez came home to a Navajo Nation that knew how to receive warriors, not through press conferences or parades, through ceremony. Traditional Navajo elders performed an enemy way ceremony for returning warriors like Chester. This was not a metaphor or a symbolic gesture. It was a living, multi-day healing ritual carried forward across generations, designed specifically to restore balance after a warrior has been in contact with death. A medicine man would have led the ceremony. There would have been singing. There would have been the smell of burning herbs and the sound of drums in the night air, not the electric air of a bus stop in a town that had just refused him a seat, but the older air of his people's land, where his return was marked and honored. The enemy way ceremony had been performed for Navajo warriors long before American statehood. It was being performed for Chester Nez the same week he was denied that bus seat. The same week. Two different worlds, both of them real. Chester Nez described the haunting images that followed him from the Pacific, the things he had seen in the forward positions, under fire, behind the radio. What we would today call post-traumatic stress, he described as something that sat behind his eyes. The ceremony helped. His people's understanding of what a warrior carries helped, but the silence did not help. The silence accumulated. Through the late 1940s, through the 50s, through the early 60s, Chester Nez went on with his life. He worked. He raised a family. He was a Navajo man, on the Navajo Nation, living in the aftermath of a war no one would let him describe. Picture a veterans gathering, sometime in the late 1950s. Other World War II veterans sit around him. Sailors describe their ships. Infantry name their battles. Chester Nez sits quietly, his coffee cup warm in his hands, the room loud with other people's memories. His contribution, the communication system Marine Major Howard Connor called indispensable, still classified. Top secret, not his to share. He listened. He said nothing. The room moved on without him. 23 years is not an abstraction. If you graduated high school in 1945, 23 years of silence means your children would be finishing college before you could speak. Before you could tell them, I did this. I was there. My voice helped hold the line. Chester Nez could not say those things, not yet. And in the meantime, men who looked like the civilian at the bus stop were being decorated, being hired, being promoted, being written into the public record, while Chester Nez kept a secret that was not even his to keep. It had been placed on him, locked on like a collar. The government that took his language as a boy had taken his story as a man. Twice over. Same institution, same silence, different method. He was 47 years old when the oath finally lifted in 1968. He had spent nearly half his life unable to speak publicly about the defining act of his youth. The Marine Corps declassified the Navajo Code Talker program in 1968. Chester Nez was allowed, at last, to say what he had done. He did not explode into the public record with bitterness. He did not demand the accounting he was owed. He began, quietly, to tell his story to anyone who would listen, not because the country deserved it, but because the story deserved to exist. Chester Nez's memoir was published in 2011. He was 90 years old. It is the only first-hand memoir by any member of the original 29. He called it Code Talker, the first and only memoir by one of the original Navajo Code Talkers. At 90, he sat down and put the whole arc on paper. The boarding school, the punished hands, the recruitment, the Pacific, the oath, the bus stop, the silence, all of it, in order, in his own words, now aloud. In that memoir, Chester Nez wrote about the institutional contradiction he had lived inside. He named it directly, clearly, without performance. He wrote, "I had to reconcile two things, that my country had tried to take my language, and then my country needed my language to survive. I chose to serve. That was the Navajo way." He did not say he forgave the boarding school. He did not say he was grateful for the contradiction. He said he reconciled it. He said he chose. That word, chose, is doing enormous work in that sentence. Chester Nez was not conscripted. He enlisted. He walked into Fort Defiance and raised his hand as a Navajo man, choosing a Navajo duty. Not because America had been good to him, it had not, but because the WWII tradition did not require a good government to have honor. It required a warrior to protect his people regardless. That is a moral position most of us will never be asked to hold. To serve a government that harmed you, in order to protect the people it never protected. His people, not the government's people, his. The Navajo Nation, in 1940, had a population of approximately 50,000 people. 50,000, smaller than the current population of Santa Fe, New Mexico. From that population, 420 men would ultimately serve as code talkers. That is roughly 1 in every 127 Navajo people, men, women, and children combined. The per capita contribution was extraordinary by any measure in any nation in that war, and Chester Nez was among the 29 who built the architecture that made all 420 possible. He did not just participate. He was a founding architect of the system. At 21 years old, with punished hands that still remembered the boarding school, the same hands that had been struck now built something that held. What Chester Nez lived through between 1945 and 1968 had no ceremony in the wider world. There was no public recognition, no news cycle, no medal being placed around his neck. He was a Navajo veteran in post-war America, navigating a world that did not know his name, and legally could not be told it. Some code talkers during those years were denied veterans' benefits they had earned. Asked to prove service, they were forbidden to describe. A cruel loop with no exit. Chester Nez carried all of this, visibly and invisibly. The visible part, a Navajo man in mid-century America facing the discrimination of that era. The invisible part, a classified record that, if he could have shown it, would have rewritten every interaction. He could not show it, so he carried it. For 23 years, that is what Chester Nez's daily life required. To walk through a world that underestimated him with full knowledge of what he had done, and to say nothing. In his later interviews, Chester Nez never described bitterness as the dominant feeling. He described something harder to name. A kind of steady grief, not for himself only, but for what the silence had cost the story itself. The story of what the Navajo people had given to a war they had never been asked to choose. The story of the original 29 men in a room at Camp Pendleton building a code from their grandmother's language, from something that had been punished, something that had survived anyway. Chester Nez grieved that the world had been made to wait so long for that story, and he grieved that he had been made to carry it alone for so many of those years. The medicine bundle he had carried in the Pacific, he kept it. Through the silence, through the post-war years, through the decades before recognition came, it was a thread back to the thing that had never been taken, the continuity of his people's identity. The government could classify his service record. It could not classify what he was. He was a Navajo man. He had always been a Navajo man. He would die a Navajo man. And on June 4, 2014, Chester Nez died. He was 93 years old. He was the last surviving member of the original 29. The last one. The original architects of the code, every single one, was now gone. But Chester Nez had published his memoir 3 years before his death. At 90, he had given the story what the government had refused to give it for decades, a voice. We are in a moment when the last code talkers from World War II are gone. Not aging, not elderly, gone. Chester Nez's memoir is the only first-hand account from the original 29 that exists. One book. One man's 90 years of memory. That is what survived from the founding architects. Everything else is secondhand. Everything else is reconstruction. That is what the 23 years of silence cost us, beyond what it cost Chester Nez personally. It cost us stories that were never told before the men who held them died. It cost us the voices of 28 other original founders who left no memoir, who died with the full weight of what they had done still partially unrecorded. The Navajo Nation today is working to preserve the Navajo language through immersion schools and tribal programs. Approximately 30% of Navajo people are now estimated to speak it fluently. The same language that children were physically punished for speaking less than a century ago. The same language that 29 young men sat in a room and bent into a code no enemy could crack. The language is still here, still surviving, still being reclaimed. Chester Nez's grandmother spoke it to him every day in Chichilta. That specific transmission, grandmother to grandson, on that specific land, became part of the architecture of victory in the Pacific. That is a lineage. It runs in one direction, forward, and it does not break. When Chester Nez chose to enlist in 1942, he made a decision inside a long sequence. The sequence goes: warrior tradition, grandmother's language, punished hands, Pacific fire, classified silence, post-war bus stop, 23 years, memoir at 90. That sequence is not a metaphor. It is a documented human life, with dates, with names, with specific physical places and specific physical costs. And at every point in that sequence, Chester Nez made a choice. At the boarding school, he kept the language alive inside himself. At Fort Defiance, he walked in and volunteered. At Camp Pendleton, he built something that had never existed. At the bus stop in 1945, he absorbed the contempt without breaking. At 90 years old, he sat down and wrote the whole thing out, named it, placed it in the record, made it impossible to ignore. There is a particular quality of grief in this story that does not resolve cleanly. The grief is not simply that Chester Nez faced discrimination. Many people face that. The grief is the specific shape of it, the magnitude of what he had done, and the mandatory silence around it. The gap between those two things, extraordinary contribution and enforced invisibility, is where the betrayal lives. The United States government created that gap deliberately and kept it open for 23 years. Chester Nez did not create it, he survived it. And when the gap was finally closed in 1968, there was no apology waiting inside it. Just a declassification notice, just the legal removal of a padlock that should never have been placed. Chester Nez was 47 years old, and the defining story of his young life was now technically speakable. He spoke it, quietly, over years, in interviews, in schools, in that memoir. He spoke with a clarity the circumstances did not earn. The circumstances earned outrage. Chester Nez often gave something rarer than outrage. He gave the full arc, without embellishment, without excision. The boarding school and the bus stop and the Pacific and the ceremony and the silence, all of it together, as a single human life that had been asked to hold more than any single life should hold, and had held it. The Navajo language did not survive a century of suppression to become a footnote. It survived because people kept it alive in their mouths when they were punished for speaking it. Chester Nez was one of those people. His grandmother was another. The kids in Navajo immersion classrooms right now are another. The lineage runs forward. It has not stopped. The story of the Navajo Code Talkers is not only a story about a code no enemy broke. It is a story about what the United States asked of people it had already harmed, and what those people chose to give anyway, on their own terms, for their own reasons, not shaped by past wrongs, not defined by them, but out of something older and more durable than any government policy. The man who built that code was denied a bus seat the week he came home from building it. He went home anyway, kept the language alive, wrote the book, and outlasted the silence by 46 years. The kids in Navajo immersion classrooms right now are another. The lineage runs forward. It has not stopped. He spoke it with what I can only call a quiet dignity that the circumstances did not earn. The circumstances earned outrage. Chester Nez often gave something harder to maintain than outrage. He gave clarity. He gave the full arc, without embellishment, without excision. The boarding school and the bus stop, and the Pacific and the ceremony and the silence, all of it together, as a single human life that had been asked to hold more than any single life should hold, and had held it, and held it. If Chester Nez's story goes untold, what remains is an abstraction, a code with no face, a classified program with no cost, a headline with no hands behind it. The code itself has been honored, studied, commemorated, but the man who built it was denied a bus seat the week he came home from building it. Those two facts belong in the same sentence. They have always belonged in the same sentence. We have been separating them for too long. The story of the Navajo Code Talkers is not only a story about an unbreakable code, it is a story about what the United States asked of people it had already harmed, and what those people chose to give anyway, on their own terms, for their own reasons, not shaped by past wrongs, not defined by them, but out of something older and more durable than any government policy,